Hello, and thank you for joining us for this MaritzCX webinar, The Importance of Segmentation. We're glad you've joined us today. I'm Tom Evans, and I'll be moderating today's event. On the program with me are our two presenters, Davis-Lenane and Frank Leinweber, and we'll get to know them a little bit better in just a minute. But before we get started, let's answer a couple of questions that we were often asked. And one is the webinar being recorded? And the answer is yes. The webcast is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the presentation within the next 24 hours. And secondly, we are planning to have a time of Q&A after Deb and Frank conclude the presentation. So if you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box on your screen, and we'll get to as many of those submitted questions as we can during that time. So thank you for hearing that, and now let's meet today's presenters. Let's start with Frank. Frank Leinweber is a senior research consultant with MaritzCX's Strategic Research Group. And he has over 30 years of marketing research experience and is responsible for working with organizations to frame research approaches that best address business issues. His industry expertise includes automotive, healthcare, financial services, consumer durables, communications, and hospitality. And prior to joining MaritzCX, Frank served as Senior Vice President at TNS. He earned his BS from Kent State University, and he has completed coursework in decision mathematics and management from Georgia State University. And Deb Davis-Lenane, she is a director with MaritzCX's Strategic Research Group, where she is primarily responsible for managing ad hoc custom research for MaritzCX's Mobility Group. She works closely with clients in the design of research, proposal development, and management of the research process, as well as analysis and presentation of research findings. Deb is a high-level quantitative analyst and proven qualitative researcher and moderator. She has played an important role in the success of qualitative and quantitative projects for a wide range of clients, including automotive OEMs, financial institutions, chemical companies, national retailers, healthcare and academic institutions across a wide variety of research types. And Deb has completed her coursework towards a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from IIT in Chicago. And with that, Frank, I think I'm turning it over to you to kick us off today. So,
yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Frank Leinweber.
My name's Deb Davis-Lenane.
And you all probably know MaritzCX because of our exposure in the customer experience area, but you may not associate us with segmentation and other types of ad hoc research. So we're delighted to be here today to share some of the lessons we've learned in conducting segmentation research over the course of our careers. So just to get started, we're going to look forward to covering a lot of great information with you today. I will level set by framing where segmentation fits into the fabric of effective marketing and its place in achieving the overarching corporate strategic direction. We'll follow up with that with a look into how this technique came to be for a deeper appreciation on exactly how far we've come as practitioners in this discipline. And we'll follow that up as well with best practices and some common mistakes, which happen more often than they really need to. Wrapping up with a view into effective alternatives that will address the variety of business needs driving the implementation of this critical tool.
So let's start off with understanding what exactly market segmentation is. If you look at the diagram on the right, that's a diagram that shows that the markets are full of different types of customers. And it's pretty simple to observe that no one product or service could appeal to all of these customers. That's why market segmentation is so important to companies today. So what's our definition of market segmentation? Well, it's a strategy, and that strategy divides the market into smaller groups of buyers who share similar needs, characteristics, and behaviors. Segmentation is it's a strategy, and it's very tactical. In fact, it borrows from military strategy in the sense of a perfect economy. In the military, in a battle, you need to know your limits and pick your battles well. That holds true also for companies. So for that reason, companies use market segmentation as a tool, first to identify groups of buyers they believe offer them the greatest possibility of success, and then to use those limited resources to selectively concentrate their marketing energies and resources to gain a competitive advantage. So why do you care about market segmentation? Well, the fact that you're here right now is one reason that tells us that you care, but here's some of the reasons why. First of all, it's a sound tactical strategy. It's really clear, for those of you who are marketers, that you cannot be all things to all customers. That strategy is very ineffective, costly, and frankly, it's unsustainable. Market research recognizes that organizations have limited resources. They're not unlimited, they're limited. So you have to be able to figure out, have a tool that lets you be able to focus your energies more narrowly and ensure that your marketing dollars get spread and have the greatest impact possible. And finally, segmentation, the output of segmentation provides great intelligence to be able for you to be able to develop the laser focus you need to be able to gain that competitive advantage within the marketplace.
So let's talk about how to use segmentation. Well, there's 4 primary categories, and those include product, mostly for product development or line extensions, customer-related initiatives for optimizing the revenue that you can expect from customers, developing loyalty initiatives that are specific to unique customer needs, and improving the overall customer experience. Also, for business strategy, it's very effective in enhancing margins, and for marketing, you're increasing the accuracy and the targeting of your media selection and the actionability of it, as well as being able to create more pointed creative messaging. So, market segmentation. While it's not quite as old as the primordial stew, it's been around for a while and has a rich history of underpinning successful companies and how they go about conducting their business.
So when we were designing this segmentation presentation, one of the questions that we asked ourselves was, hey, how did this all come about? We've been doing it for a long time, and we wanted to understand the origins so we could share that with you. So this is how it started. In the middle 50s, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Wendell Smith. He was a researcher at Ederson and Sessions, and he published a very important article in the Journal of Marketing. That article introduced the concept of market segmentation. And there's we included a picture of the cover of the journal. The name of the title of that article was Product Differentiation and Marketing Segmentation as Alternative Strategies. And the idea was his early concept, which was kind of new, and you got to think about that this is in the 50s, was that there was a tool called market segmentation that could be used to inform product differentiation strategies. That means how to figure out what people want and how to devise products that were unique to those special user groups to identify, again, to improve marketing efficiency and stimulate demand. So for all of us, for us here today, we understand the concept of product differentiation, but that wasn't always the way. And that's why Dr. Smith's article was so seminal. In the late 20s, and we'll use an automotive example, we come from the mobility group. In the late 20s, the Model T was one of the biggest sellers of that time frame. And one of the reasons it was such a great seller is that their competitive advantage, which was something that was kind of new, was the idea that a car could be affordable. Through the genius of Henry Ford, he was able to retool the assembly line and be able to produce the car at a lower cost and make it affordable. Fast forward 30 years, and you have some big changes. You have changes in technology that now enable people to be able to manufacture products in much smaller volumes. You have the growth of affluence within the middle class. And then you have greater sophistication in analytical methods. All those things together drive the idea that the market now, the customers who have more affluence, they don't want the one-size-fits-all Model T-like car. They want a car that delivers to their unique needs. And that's how the first real advertisement that we see that really pushes product differentiation and use market segmentation was for our friends at General Motors. They came up with a tagline that said, "A car for every purse and every purpose."
Okay, let's take a look under the hood of segmentation research now. What is it? What does it do? And how can we rein in the powerful impact of it to use it to its greatest advantage? Well, sometimes all customers look alike. Your early adopters look like your heavy users, who look like your brand evangelists, who, curiously, look like your repeat buyers and your infrequent buyers. But it's what's under the hood that represents the unique importance and potential for each of these groups. Demographically, they're all similar in age, gender, income. So you know what your customers want. You need to know what your customers want, rather, and how they behave and what they're thinking. So segmentation provides these basic insights into your most important customers. So many companies think products sell because of their features, but consumers are more likely to buy based on the benefits they associate with those products. And this isn't always obvious from a product planning or a marketing point of view. For example, Coca-Cola is a great product and has a broad customer base both domestically and internationally, and the people who purchase do it for a variety of reasons. So Coke is certainly a refreshing break on a hot day, and it can also be a mealtime beverage. But some people use Coke around the house for different reasons, including as an odor killer, to clean corroded batteries, even remove rust and protect against pests. Sounds like a good reason to keep some Coke around the house, doesn't it? So this expanded customer and use base increases sales, if only marginally. Varying the product message to focus on a target group, adapting how and where the message is delivered and where the product is made available creates tremendous opportunities for additional sales. So this is just one example of how segmentation intelligence can create new or incremental users.
So let's talk about the path forward, the path basically to Emerald City, to the best outcome. So here are some of the rules of the road, basically. One, there's no one size. The bad news is there's no one size fits all segmentation approach. Just as no one product or service appeals to all customers, there's no one size fits all approach to segmentation. It means that there's a lot of moving parts that are involved. Getting it right looks simple, but it's very complex. It requires very skilled level, a lot of engagement with stakeholders and a skilled team to be able to understand the nuances of design and choose the right approaches and variables and analytics. And then finally, it's not just about the numbers. Many of the decisions that are required for a good outcome for segmentation are subjective, and they're not empirically verifiable. That's where the art of segmentation comes into play.
So, most businesses see segmentation as crucial for their success. But despite that need, too often the segmentation just doesn't yield the insights that can be translated into action. In one study that we saw that was published in the Harvard Business Review, saw really only 1 in 7 senior executives said that they derived any real value from their segmentation effort. So let's take a look at some of the basic segmentation concepts and some of the common mistakes that we've seen over our years of conducting segmentation research. In our experience, we've noticed some common missteps that can and should be avoided. And here's our roadmap for reviewing the 5 common mistakes and best practices that we've developed along the way.
So let's start with mistake number 1, and this is, my friends, my colleagues, very important. That mistake is limiting stakeholder engagement. Segmentation research demands a substantial investment. It requires a pretty large budget. You're collecting data for 2,000, 5,000, 10. Sometimes we collect data for 30,000 from 30,000 respondents. It requires a lot of talent to be able to understand, again, how do you choose the elements that will provide the best design and the best outcome. And then certainly it requires a lot of time, resources. And that's not just on the vendor side or the supplier side, it's also on the client side. So this most important, so what we're finding is this common misstep that we see that really limits the value or the value or importance of the outcomes is limiting the involvement of key stakeholders throughout the process and particularly up front in the design stage. Segmentation is very complex, and you need the input from stakeholders early on to be able to understand what their information needs are, what the research objectives are, what the expectations are as far as outcomes, and then how they're going to use the information to make decisions. If you don't do that, you risk, first of all, the threat of having a failed effort, and then you also put segmentation into a black box. Your stakeholders don't understand the process, the decisions that are made, and then consequently, they may not have trust they may have trust in the process, therefore they may not support it, and certainly they may not use the information to make the important changes to strategy that segmentation can provide. So here are our best practices. Think 3 C's: communication, collaboration, and commitment. One of the first things that we do when we get a segmentation project is we want to be able to identify all the key stakeholders. We want to be able to listen to their needs and expectations, and we want to let them know what the process and the purposes of segmentation. Very important. That by doing that, by listening to the stakeholders, you avoid delivering a product or an outcome that doesn't meet expectations, that you make sure that the stakeholders' needs are met, that you make sure that you understand their information goals and how they're going to use that data or the findings before you go through the process of designing and conducting the research. Second thing that's really important is when you bring that group of stakeholders together, it's very likely that they're going to have conflicting information needs and goals. So at that point, very early at the first kickoff meeting, you want to be able to align key stakeholders on the objectives of the program and then how the information is going to be used. And there's an old saying that we say, if a segmentation gets too broad, it isn't very effective. So expect that when you have that stakeholder dialogue, that there'll be conflicting needs that need to be resolved. The other important part of engaging stakeholders is developing a communication plan. We do this in advance. Once we know who the stakeholders are, we assess their level of interest. Everybody gets informed, subject to what our client wants, and those people that have greater interest, we involve more heavily in providing detail of the process and in decision making.
Okay, so mistake number 2. As the saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And that is true with segmentation research as well. There are multiple methods and approaches out there, and many reasons, including cost, data availability, time frame, rigor, and more, to utilize one or another of these options. We use the term approach to describe the general direction or category of discriminating variables used for segmenting. And common segmentation approaches include demographics, attitudinal, behavioral, and needs-based. And many of you probably know that historically, geographic and demographic approaches were very popular as the segments were easily identifiable and accessible. But that popularity has really faded over time as research has demonstrated that those basis variables really have only weak or no predictive value at all. So the 3 alternatives which we at MaritzCX most often employ are needs-based, attitudinal segmentation, and database segmentation. And we often see that a combination or a hybrid approach is effective, but let's talk about each one of these in a bit more detail. Let's start off with needs-based segmentation. This is a survey-based approach, and it's very common and investigates consumers' need states and where gaps exist. It's a very good application for product development efforts. Designing products that best meet the unmet needs of customer groups typically results in greater customer engagement and increased loyalty. The objective of this approach is to find those white spaces that can be exploited. Needs-based segmentation often initiates with qualitative research to identify product usage patterns, and then the segmentation effort is used to confirm and quantify how great of a need actually exists among the customer groups that are important to the enterprise. Another survey-based approach categorizes customer groups by their shared attitudes. And this approach is particularly applicable for the generation or adaptation of messaging. Identifying and including deeply held attitudes or belief systems in outreach efforts resonates at a deep level with customers by addressing their foundational viewpoints. When brands connect with customers at this visceral level, it results in a deeper connection to the brand and increases relevance. These are the connections that motivate brand evangelism and bolster customer loyalty. Successful companies capitalize on this impact by reinforcing this brand promise at all touch points, resulting in an enduring significance and long life cycles. And then database segmentation. This uses an existing, usually a large database, often industry-specific syndicated studies. And these segmentations are very cost-effective since they eliminate fieldwork costs, and they typically provide substantial sample sizes as well. These segmentations can also be constrained, though, by what's included in the database, including the scales that may not be ideal for our purposes. So these sources may not contain all the desired variables, potentially missing attitudinal or behavioral or some other criteria. On the other hand, the data contained in the database could also make this a more comprehensive alternative than a custom designed effort.
So let's talk about our best practices. The three approaches that Frank discussed, all of those approaches seek to triangulate or converge the data to be able to describe the market and identify groups of customers that share similar needs. But whether you look at the lens that you use, which is basically the approach, defines the direction as far as the final outcome and the information that you receive. So if you're looking to be able to inform decisions about messaging and brand objectives, then you want to focus on an attitudinal approach. An attitudinal approach basically captures measurements of the mind. It captures affective and cognitive elements that underlie values and beliefs. So that's the direction you want to go. If your focus for the information that you're going to use for strategies is for product service development, then you want to use a needs-based approach. Why do you want to do that? Because needs-based approaches, their focus is on understanding the benefits sought in products, product attention. It's much more forward-thinking, and again, appropriate for product service development types of decisions. Finally, Frank talked about the database approach. The database approach also has some real strengths, and it's best if you have a segmentation, if your segmentation solution or the segments, you want to track them on a more continuous basis, or you really need a deep dive into detail. Those databases tend to capture things like past purchase behavior. Their advantage, again, very large sample size. Some of the databases for syndicated are 300,000 respondents, so great, again, for continuous tracking. But let me just make this very clear, that even though we have three different approaches we talk about, those boundaries aren't solid. There is overlap across each of those, and you can have what we call a hybrid approach. And you can incorporate the best from or certain variables from the attitudinal approach and the needs-based approach if that best meets your needs. And that type of approach is effective with all types of objectives.
Okay, so moving on now, the third mistake is not considering a priori segments. Markets can be segmented using a large variety of different criteria, but having the right set of variables to specify or identify market segments is challenging. So given market complexity, excluding a priori theories of potential or expected segments is a common mistake. And without this consideration, the choice of variables to describe segments could be flawed. So, how do you go about addressing that? So, what we at MaritzCX recommend is that you consider creating some hypothetical segments, because there's many situations in marketing research, which many of you probably know, where going in with a blank slate and letting the data dictate the results is a great idea. In this way, there are no preconceived notions to color how the results will be interpreted, no straw man, you're not skewing how the results are eventually employed. And some feel that this is appropriate for segmentation research as well. And what we found, though, is that there is considerable benefit in envisioning or structuring a marketplace prior to conducting the research. Conceptualizing expected segments during the design phase is valuable when you're constructing the survey instrument. Developing questions, if survey research is the optimal approach, based on the expected structure of the data, enables the researcher to account for criteria that will provide the cohesion and distinction necessary for constructing actionable segments. The data will subsequently either prove or disprove those hypotheses and result in a much more sound outcome. Okay, moving on. Mistake number 4 is with making ineffective algorithms. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. Ineffective algorithms have very low accuracy in classifying respondents into segments, which actually threatens the validity of the research. So effective algorithms classify respondents with a high rate of accuracy. And classification accuracy measures how effectively the discriminator variables that are chosen place respondents reliably into one segment or another. And we view segmentation algorithms in 2 ways. One is the segment classifier, which is used initially to provide the initial segments from the research results. And those are what are our core set of segments. And then we have a screening algorithm that we typically employ, which is used to identify respondents that fit target profiles for subsequent research, whether it's online or even to recruit for focus groups. So what are some of the best practices here? Again, you should strive for a high classification accuracy rate. And at MaritzCX, we strive for 90%, where we try to keep it within 80 to 90%, and we test that based on keeping a subset of customers to the side, and then trying to segment them based on the criteria used to see how effective our segmentation algorithm is. So sort of a test-retest kind of approach. We also recommend creating that segment screener tool simultaneously with the initial segmentation algorithm to ensure that you have high classification rates down the road as well, and keeping that parsimony in the number of variables. We also recommend not creating that segment screener after the solution is selected. And we also have found that cross-modal utilization of that screening tool is problematic. So if you design the segmentation, the classifier tool based on online research results, we found that doesn't translate well or doesn't convert well to a telephone application. There's just the nature of how people respond online versus on the phone.
Great. So now mistake number 5. The segmentation has too narrow of a focus. That's a common criticism that we hear. That focus is too narrow for stakeholder use. And why does that happen? Well, as we all know, the survey research world is changing. People take the surveys on their mobile phones. It was harder to get response rates. So segmentation studies usually have a pretty long survey. We need to ask, they're thirsty for information. We need to ask a lot of questions. So what we find is that to avoid the burden, the fatigue on our customers, we're moving more and more towards the idea of being able to append the data or look for alternative sample sources to be able to conduct the segmentation and get great data, the detail that we need, and also offer tracking capabilities. So let's talk about our best practices. So our best practice is linked to other information sources. There's a lot of third-party, and we have 3 of them that we link to other information sources. So we have 3 different ways that we do that we have used and work well for us, and we're sharing these as best practices. First, we use, you can enrich your data, enrich the segmentation information with a data overlay. There's a lot of companies out there that collect data. You've heard of Experian and Axiom and Prism, those types of companies. And what they do, they collect data on people's lifestyle, financial, their demographic data. So tap into those. Do the segmentation study with the primary questions, your unique questions, and then overlay with that data to be able to extend the detail that you have and make the outcome more actionable. The next best practice we have is linked to an ongoing segmentation or a syndicated study. Automotive, we have a study. Almost every industry, there's some kind of syndicated study, and those studies do a great job as far as being very comprehensive to describe the industry. So take the best of both worlds, conduct your segmentation study using your customized questions, and then work with a team market science group to be able to link those. And when you link those, then you have access. You might have access of a sample, let's say with our study of 300,000. You can drill down, sometimes in an automotive study, to the model level, look at respondents who maybe, who are, millennials who live in the Southwest region. When you collect primary data, it's hard to collect first of all, those sample sizes to be able to provide that level of drill down detail, and also the length of the survey, you can't capture that much information. So you might ask, how do we do that? Well, we do it, a marketing science, it's very complex, but we have, sophisticated methods where we figure out we look at the algorithm from the segmentation study, we match it up with we construct a model that links it to another study, and then when we integrate it, you're able to monitor. First of all, look at your segments with more detail, especially your target segment. But the really important thing with looking at a segmentation study, using a segmentation study, is that you're able to then monitor how that segment evolves. So is your target segment getting larger, smaller? Are their attitudes changing? Is feature importance changing? Very important. The third type of best practice that we're seeing, and we're doing a lot of this, is actually using a syndicated study as the base or sample source for the segmentation itself. Why do you do that? Again, like you just mentioned, those syndicated studies have very large samples. They're refreshed on a regular basis. So although there are limits, you're limited to the questions that are within the syndicated study. Most of these studies have 700 plus questions. So you're able to, again, get a really good view of the market, because most of the questions they include describe the market, and you're able, again, to monitor on an ongoing basis. The other advantage of using a syndicated study as a sample source is you don't have to collect data. Data is already there, process can be quicker, and again, it's refreshed. So those are our best practices.
Okay, so let's go ahead and summarize some of the learning that we've gone through now, and we'll begin with limiting that stakeholder engagement. So what the learning is, you need to engage stakeholders early in the process by listening to their needs and what their objectives are and what their expectations are. In the communication progress, regular communicate progress regularly throughout the course of the study. So as Deb mentioned, it's the communication, the collaboration, and the commitment. Then take into consideration those a priori theories about the segments. So you have some preconceived hypotheses that you can test to see if they actually hold up in the marketplace based on the data that you collected. And then finally, align the segmentation approach with the objectives of the product category, which I think is pretty obvious, to make sure that we have the most effective result possible.
And then as far as ineffective algorithms, best practice, construct an effective screening algorithm and segment classifier simultaneously. And finally, when you're considering to extend the value of the data, consider linking, harness the power of external data sources, link your segmentation where you can. So that's it. So thank you very much for joining us. I think we're going to pass it back to Tom.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thanks for that presentation, Deb and Frank. Super insight from a couple of super smart market researchers for sure. So I'm certain everyone listening today has learned a lot about segmentation that they may not have known prior, and some good best practices. I can also see there are several questions that have come in, so we have some time. Let's get to those. This person, you mentioned classification accuracy for algorithms. How exactly is that calculated?
Frank, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, we typically look at the, as I mentioned before, we use a test and retest method. So when we provide we construct the original algorithm, we employ that algorithm on a set-aside sample to see if we're getting the same types of results from that as we did with the initial group.
That's commonly called a hold-up sample that we use, but that's how it's done.
Okay, great. And if you do have a question, go ahead and remember just to submit that through the question box on your screen.
Okay.
Can you talk more about identifying hypothetical segments ahead of time? Like how do you approach that? How are clients involved in that phase?
Well, sure, absolutely. One of the advantages of the hypothetical, looking at the hypothetical, first of all, these segmentations, like I mentioned before, they're very thirsty for information. So being able to talk to the stakeholders, your stakeholders, and industry experts like, ourselves and other people in other industries, to be able to understand what people hypothesize as the segments within that define the marketplace is very important. And one of the key reasons is this. First of all, we want to test to see whether those hypotheses are correct. But even more importantly, we want to make sure that we understand the market, what people think is the market, and make sure that we include variables, predictor variables that will tap into the construct. We want to make sure that we don't make a type 1 error where we don't include a variable that's really key to being able to identify a segment, and we miss being able to identify that segment or describe it well because we don't understand it. So that's why we do that, and it's very important.
Great, thank you. How often should a segmentation schema be refreshed?
I think that's a really good question. Do you want to answer that, Frank, or?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there's different perspectives on it, and I think it's really dictated by the marketplace that you're measuring. Some more high growth marketplace like technology may lend themselves to more frequent refresh than a more mature type of industry, maybe like packaged goods, for example. So maybe as a rule of thumb, let it guide you with the product development process or the product introduction process and how customers react to those. So if it's a dynamic marketplace, you're probably going to want to take a look at those segmentation solutions a little bit more frequently. But relative to that, we should be taking a look at the segments and how they're evolving as well, and that can be typically a 2 or 3 year cycle to see if the segments are still comprised the same way, if they've changed, the dynamic within the segment has changed. So have those people grown older, or have they moved toward a different needs set, or have attitudes changed based on any kind of environmental kind of effects? So
let me just add one more thing. I think one of the biggest contributors as far as how often you refresh is the level of disruption to the industry. So for those industries where there's a lot of disruption, like Frank said, with new technology, again, you want to do that more frequently. So you want to maybe look at your segmentation every 2 years. Otherwise, maybe every 3-4 years might be the normal cadence. One of the reasons we're seeing more and more of our clients want to marry their segmentation study into a syndicated study is because of the continuous refreshing and the ability to be able to monitor, how those segments change. Very important. And that may be the optimal solution as far as refreshing. Continuous.
Okay, great. And if you're out there and you have a question, go ahead and submit that. We just have really a couple more questions.
I think we had one more here. Has any of your work uncovered that attitudes, needs, etc., change among different demographic segments, such as women, Asian Americans, millennials, etc.? Of course, we see differences in their attitudes, based on a big factor is age cohort, because the values, the beliefs, and the underlying values of those different types of age groups are different depending on their experience. For those people who are millennials who grew up with a computer, their experience and the way they process information and their values are much different than boomers. So yes, very important. With women, depending on what their needs are, absolutely. Less with ethnicity, but again, it depends on the context, the industry, the product category.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And what is the typical sample size required for a segmentation study?
That's another good question, and there's a couple of different perspectives on it, but typically we recommend usually larger rather than smaller to account for the number of segments that could fall out, because we want to make sure that they're large enough to be able to market to and be actionable within the organization. A rule of thumb may be 1,000 completes. Typically you're not, and that's for a survey-based research, maybe attitudinal needs-based, as opposed to a database approach, which you have, I wouldn't say unlimited sample, but typically a lot larger sample sizes. So you have a lot more observations within each of the segments that you might construct.
Yeah, excellent. Let me just add to what Frank said. He's absolutely right. 1,000's a great benchmark, because typically we'll see like 5 or 6 segments, for a lot of industries. The rule of thumb that we use also is like basically 200 to 300 per hypothesized segment. That's why, again, going back to the idea of talking to your stakeholders and industry experts to understand what their hypotheses are as far as the way the market they think is segmented. That gives you an idea as how many segments, and then you can make a good estimation as far as sample size. It also depends on how much you want to drill down. Like I said before, some of the studies, we actually collect almost 30,000 respondents for some customers, because they need to be able to drill down with a lot of precision across a lot of variables.
Yeah, and a lot of times cost is a limiting factor too. You only have so much money to spend, so you try to optimize the amount of sample that you end up with based on that budget. But as a rule of thumb, 1,000 is usually a pretty good target.
Great. Is there any difference in approaches to segmentation, whether it be B2B or B2C?
Well, certainly you don't have an option for a database situation in a lot of industries for B2B samples, but I think for B2B there's some unique kind of considerations. Typically your sample sizes are going to be smaller because your population is smaller, whereas in a B2C type of orientation, you're usually looking at a broad-based population. Relative to the the variables that you're mentioning, depending on what you're trying to achieve with the research, that can have an impact on how you select the types of questions you ask. Mostly we see in B2B, it's more needs-based kinds of an orientation, so more behavioral kinds of things, more so than attitudinal, but those are also important because companies communicate to other companies too. So there's a lot of overlap.
Right. I think that what you said is it makes perfect sense, Frank. The other consideration is the distribution system with B2B. You can have a one-step or two-step, so that needs to be taken into account. And as Frank said, smaller sample sizes are usually okay because when you're talking B2C or B2B, you're talking about people that have a pretty level set knowledge about the industry. And it's less about feelings and more about knowledge and interest in product.
Okay, great. And should there be a ceiling on how many segments to chase to be effective?
Great question. Really great question. And, there's that's a kind of a marketing science question. But when we're looking at the segmentation solutions, I mean, it depends on, again, you want to make, it's not so much the ceiling, it's how many segments describe the market. And some markets, that segment, that number is smaller, some it's larger. You're certainly not going to chase. So the question of how many segments maybe isn't as important as this question. How many target segments should you chase? Because you're not going to chase everything. And so that's maybe what you have to think about.
Yeah, I agree, Deb, and I think that it's really dependent on how finally you want to segment your marketplace. And we've seen segmentations which are very effective with only 5 segments. We've also seen customers that have
17
or more. So the problem is when you get to these larger solutions where you have 10, 15 segments, you unfortunately get some very small segments that, and I think Deb referred to this earlier, may be good for more of a line extension orientation, but that's usually very small, very incremental benefit in general. So we typically provide a number of different solutions when we perform segmentation. So we will offer 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and see which ones are best. We want to make sure that the segments are discriminated one from the other, and that that they're all cohesive. And typically, we like to have segments that are maybe not really large, but large enough to make a difference.
Okay, super. And actually, you two have answered all the questions that have come in. So great job. Thank you for the questions that were submitted. If you do have a question you think of later, you can see the contact information for both Deb and Frank on the screen here. And feel free to shoot them an email, give them a ring with any questions you might have as follow-up. With that, we're going to close today's webcast, give you another 10 minutes back in your day. And I'd like to thank Frank and Deb for a great presentation and for all the work that went into providing this for us. And then also Dana Johansson doing the technology for the webcast. So with that, we're going to close and look for the next invite to the MaritzCX webcast series soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.